Hello, welcome to Coaching Com, the power of rapport in student behavior support. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. Before we get started, I just want to quickly acknowledge the work that each of you do. Supporting students, especially in moments of dysregulation, is not always easy, and it requires the patience, consistency, and a lot of intentionality. So today we're going to focus on how school-based professionals can better understand student behavior and how we can respond in ways that support regulation, connection, and long-term growth. Hello, my name is Jolene Vallejo. I'm a licensed master social worker here in Texas, and I currently serve as a mental health specialist within an education service center, where I support school districts across the lower Rio Grande Valley. In my role, I work closely with social workers and counselors through one of our grants, where we provide campus training, mental health trainings, support during crisis situations, and help build systems that strengthen student mental health. I will say, one of my favorite parts of the work I get to do is supporting staff wellness. Because we all know that when we're pouring into others all day, we have to make sure that we're also taking care of ourselves. As the saying goes, we cannot pour from an empty cup. Throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to work in a variety of settings, including public schools, alternative education programs, faith-based settings, and adult mental health. These experiences have really shaped my passion for this work, especially helping professionals like you utilize those practical, trauma-informed strategies to support student behavior and emotional regulation. Once again, I'm really glad that you're here today, and I'm excited to spend some time together to share some tools that you can take back with you. Now let's review some learning goals and objectives for today's session. Number 1, explore trauma. Understanding how trauma impacts the brain is essential for recognizing its effects on student behavior and emotional responses in educational settings. Number 2, we will recognize patterns, because identifying behavior patterns connected to those underlying emotional needs allows us as educators and social workers to address the root causes and support students effectively in their emotional regulation. Number 3, apply strategies. We will be implementing rapport building strategies that can significantly enhance our individual interactions with students, fostering a supportive environment that encourages emotional healing and growth. The goal is that you're able to walk away with strategies you can realistically use in your daily work. But before we go further, I want to take a moment to ground us in why this topic matters. Because when we talk about behavior, we're not just talking about classroom management. We're talking about how students experience school, how they feel safe, and whether they're able to regulate, learn, and engage. And the reality is, we can have the best strategies, the best interventions, and the best intentions. But without connection, those strategies don't stick. My hope is to strengthen your role as a social worker in supporting emotional regulation. And we do that through the power of rapport and student support. Let's get started. As we get started, I invite you into a brief moment of reflection. As you listen to these questions, think about your past or your current experiences. If you have something to write with, feel free to jot down your thoughts or simply take a mental note. What do you wish others understood about student anger? What is one small action that can prevent escalation? What helps you stay emotionally regulated at work? And what challenges make behavioral support difficult on your campus or in your agency? Whatever came to mind in that moment, just know that it matters, and the work that you do matters. So let's take a look at why. Before we jump into the content, let's talk about the urgency of our work, because your work matters. Schools are seeing an increasing level of behavior escalation, and every day you're walking into moments that are not always predictable. They're not always easy, and sometimes they're not even fully understood. The early intervention and the relationship building that you do matters, because as social workers, we play a critical role in the prevention and in the response. Your presence, your tone, and your response can make a significant difference. You're often the first person to respond when a student is struggling. And while it may not always feel like it in the moment, the way you show up can create a sense of safety, stability, and regulation for that student. Even the small moments, how you speak, how you pause, how you choose to respond, they have a lasting impact. And I want you to take a moment to think about this. Can you think of a time when you were a life preserver for a student? A moment where a student was struggling and your response de-escalated the situation. What did you do in that moment? How did that impact the outcome? Those moments matter more than you realize. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge the reality of what we're seeing. The concerns around student behavior. Across schools, we're seeing an increasing concern around the intense and escalating behavior. The aggression, the emotional outbursts, and the defiance. They're not isolated moments anymore. They're becoming more frequent and at times more intense. And in those moments, situations can feel unpredictable and even overwhelming, maybe for yourself, for staff, and for students. And there's also a growing concern around safety, not just physically, but emotionally, and within our school environments. And for many of us, there's an ongoing question underneath it all. How do we respond effectively in these moments? How do we address the behavior while we're still supporting the student in front of us? Because these behaviors absolutely need to be addressed, but how we respond is what shapes what happens next. So before we talk about how to respond, we have to understand what we're actually seeing. Because one of the most important things to remember is that behavior is communication. Understanding student behavior. One of the most important things to remember is that behavior is communication. Students are not just acting out, they're often expressing a need, often without having those skills to say it directly. And there's many contributing factors. Sometimes it's trauma and adverse experiences, the basic unmet needs, such as sleep, food, safety, or lack of connection. Relationship stressors, things that are happening at home, like divorce. Difficulties with emotional regulation, and sometimes developmental or mental health challenges, whether they're diagnosed or not. So when we see behavior, we want to look beyond the action. It's time to shift our lens and to begin to ask, what might be driving this? Now let's take a moment to look at the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. Many of you may already be familiar with this, but as a quick reminder, ACEs refers to the early life stressors, such as abuse, neglect, or household challenges that can significantly impact a child's development. ACEs can significantly impact the emotional and the behavioral responses. How a student responds to stress, how they build relationships, and how they regulate their behavior. Because the reality is, when students walk into our office, when they walk into campuses, they don't walk in as blank slates. Many are carrying experiences of stress or adversity that can shape how they respond to their environments. So, what might look like defiance or disengagement may actually be a stress response. And when we begin to understand student backgrounds, it helps us guide support. It shifts how we show up. We move from asking what's wrong with the student to what might this student be carrying? And that shift allows us to respond with greater empathy, intention, and effectiveness. I'll also include an ACEs handout in the resource section if you'd like to explore this further. I want you to take a moment to think about this. Can you think of a student you've worked with whose behavior made more sense once you understood what they were going through? How did that understanding change your response? This is why ACEs matters. Because when we recognize that behavior may be rooted from past experiences, it changes how we see the student in front of us. As mentioned, we begin to look behind the behavior, beyond it, and we consider what they might be carrying. And that's the shift that allows us to respond with that greater empathy, the intention, and the effectiveness. So keep that in mind. Now let's look at what the response might actually look like in the moment. Impact of trauma on the brain. So if behavior is communication and experiences shape that behavior, then the next layer is understanding what's happening in the brain. When students experience ongoing stress or trauma, their brain adapts for survival. That chronic stress affects their brain development, and this can keep them in what we call the survival mode, where the brain is constantly scanning for danger, even when there isn't an immediate threat. As a result, we may see difficulties with their emotional regulation, impulse control, and decision making. For example, a student might be given a simple redirection and they suddenly shut down. They become defiant or escalate. From the outside, it may look like overreacting, but internally, their brain may be responding as if they're under threat. Because in these moments, behavior is often a response to a perceived threat, not intentional misbehavior. So instead of focusing on the behavior we see, we begin to consider what the brain may be responding to in that moment. So now let's look at how the brain responds under stress. This is where understanding the brain is helpful. This model is also adapted from Dan Siegel from a concept called flipping your lid. So here we have the thinking brain. The thinking brain, or the prefrontal cortex, is responsible for problem solving and decision making. When students are calm, this area is active and it's engaged, allowing for effective learning. But when students are overwhelmed, their thinking brain, the part responsible for the reasoning and the problem solving, it goes offline. And the emotional brain, or the limbic system, triggers automatic reactions to perceived threats. Under stress, this part can dominate. It can lead to the impulsive behaviors rather than the thoughtful responses. And then we also have the survival brain, primarily governed by the amygdala, the fight, the flight, or the freeze. So in these moments, we have to remember that the reasoning, the lecturing, or giving consequences in that moment may not be effective. What we have to focus on is helping the student regulate first, or balancing the brain. Before we can respond effectively, we first have to recognize the signs of student distress. What does distress look like? Because distress doesn't always show up the same way. For some students, it may look like increased aggression, verbal, physical, or even emotional outbursts. For others, it might be withdrawal from peers, activities, shutting down, or difficulty focusing. Sometimes it shows up physically, like frequent headaches, stomach aches, maybe expression of self-harm or hopelessness, heightened irritability or defiance, noticeable changes in their sleep, in their appetite, or their appearance, ongoing worry or fear, maybe even a decrease in their grades, lack of attendance. These are some of the ways that distress can present in our students. And while these behaviors may look different, they're often signals that a student is struggling with something deeper. So instead of just reacting to the behavior, we begin to recognize and see these as possible signs of distress. When these needs go unrecognized or unsupported, it doesn't just impact the individual student, it impacts the entire school environment. We may see disruptions to learning, difficulty following rules or authority, peer conflict and bullying, property damage, physical altercations, and at times, safety concerns on campus. And for staff, this can lead to frustration, to burnout, and to feeling unsure of how to respond effectively. So this isn't just about one student. This is about creating environments where both the students and the staff feel supported. Let's take another moment to reflect on your own campus or your agency. What strategies does your school or agency currently use to support student regulation? Do you have a calm space? Do you have a calm corner? Maybe a reset room? What has been the most effective? And where are the gaps? Just take a few moments to think about that. Because at the core of this work are the questions we choose to ask. So instead of asking what's wrong with the student, we shift our lens. We ask what has happened to the student, what is the student experiencing, and most importantly, what support do they need right now? Because the questions that we ask shape the way that we respond. And one of the most powerful ways we begin to meet those needs is through connection. Before we move into the strategies, let's take a moment to bring all of this together. We've talked about how behavior is communication and how it's often influenced by factors beneath the surface. We explored how experiences like ACEs and ongoing stress impact the brain and how they can show up in student behavior. And we recognize that many behaviors are actually responses to a perceived threat, not intentional misbehavior. So, what does this mean for our practice? What does this mean for us as social workers? Well, it means that we look beyond the behavior and we consider what's driving it. We become more intentional with how we respond, not reacting in the moment. And we focus on creating that safety and supporting regulation. We recognize that our relationships and consistency can directly influence the student's outcome. Let's take a moment to apply what we've discussed. Imagine this scenario. A student is asked to put their phone away during class or in the hallway, and they immediately become defensive. They raise their voice. and they refuse to comply. The situation begins to escalate. Before jumping to a response, take a moment to think. What might be happening beneath the surface? What could the student be responding to? And how might we approach this differently? In a moment like this, it's easy for us to focus on the behavior. But when we consider what we've learned about the stress, the trauma, the brain, and perceived threat, we begin to see that the student may be reacting. And that's where our response matters, because how we show up can either escalate the situation or help regulate it. And that often begins with the connection. Rapport is the foundation of everything we do, the foundation of change. And I want to pause here because this is really the heart of our work as social workers. Rapport is not built in one conversation. It's not built in one successful de-escalation. It's built over time through consistent, small interactions. And something I want to acknowledge, especially for us as school social workers or social workers in your agency, we're not always available. We often have large caseloads, maybe multiple campuses, and crisis situations that arise. So the goal isn't for students to only feel regulated when we are present. The goal is to help them build the skills to regulate even when we're not there. Because relationships come before the correction. Students respond to people they trust. So when we think about building rapport, here are a few key elements that really shape that trust. First, consistency. Students need to experience us as steady and predictable. Emotional safety. They need to feel safe enough to engage, especially when they're already feeling overwhelmed. Choice and voice. Feeling heard rather than just being told what to do can make a big difference in how they respond. And a non-judgmental presence. How we show up, calm, open, and without judgment. That matters just as much as what we say. For example, a student shuts down when they're asked to participate and they put their head down. If we focus only on that behavior, we might say, you need to sit up and engage. But what if that student doesn't feel emotionally safe? Then that correction can lead to even more withdrawal. Instead, a simple check-in. Hey, I noticed you seemed off today. Are you okay? This gives the student a sense of voice and choice in that moment, and it can completely shift what happens next. While these moments are powerful, what really strengthens that trust is that consistency over time. So what does creating safety through consistency look like? When we talk about supporting our students, the rapport and the consistency are foundational. For us as social workers, that often starts with simply being visible and intentional, the consistent interactions, the clear routines and expectations. That might look like introducing yourself on campus and letting students know who you are, what your role is, and that you're a safe and supportive person they can come to. Even offering those stable environments in your office setting. From my own experience, it's all about the small, consistent moments. I used to stand at my office door, greeting students as they walk by, learning their names, and creating opportunities for connection. Because for many students, connection has to come before correction. And when we show up consistently, calm, predictable, and present, we begin to build trust. When we follow through with our students, when we say we're going to follow up with them, and when we have those predictable responses, that trust becomes the foundation for everything that we do. With that being said, let's also talk about the reality of our work as social workers. Sometimes building trust sounds like being transparent, being honest about our availability. I can't meet with you right now, but I'll check in on you tomorrow. And then actually following through with it. Because students don't need us to be perfect. They need us to be honest, consistent, and when our words match our actions, that's also what builds trust over time. Because how we show up matters. The attunement and the professional ethics. Attunement is in the small things, right? It's in our body language, it's being open, relaxed, our tone, staying calm, and even slowing our pace when a student is feeling overwhelmed. For example, when a student comes into your office setting, are we going to choose to sit behind the desk or meet the student where they're at in a close proximity where they feel comfortable? It's also in how we listen, not just to respond, but to reflect, saying things like, I hear you. Thank you for sharing. That makes sense. This helps the student feel seen and understood. But at the same time, report in our role doesn't mean removing structure. Because as social workers, we also have ethical responsibilities outlined by the National Association of Social Workers to maintain those clear boundaries, to be transparent about our roles, about ethical guidelines, confidentiality, and follow those established guidelines. So we're constantly balancing both empathy and attunement with consistency and structure. Because students don't just need us to be kind, they don't need us to be perfect. They need us to be predictable, safe, and trustworthy. So once we've recognized the importance of reports and consistency, we can apply more strategies that we can use to support students more effectively. When it comes to one-on-one conversations, there's a few approaches that can make a meaningful difference. First, asking open-ended questions. These invite students to share rather than shutting the conversation down with a simple yes or no. So instead of asking, are you okay? We might consider asking, what's been going on today? Or what made that moment feel difficult? This can help us understand what's really beneath the behavior instead of making assumptions. Second, validating student autonomy. Even when we're setting expectations, students still need to feel a sense of control, a sense of independence. That might sound like, you have a couple of options. What do you think would work best? Or, I'm here to support you, but this is your choice. When students feel like they have a voice, they're more likely to engage rather than resist. Third, using scaling questions, like 1 to 10 check-ins. Depending on the student, depending on the age, this can give a student a simple, low-pressure way to express how they're feeling, especially if they're not ready to fully open up. For example, on a scale 1 to 10, how are you right now? Or on a scale 1 to 10, how's your day going so far? And what's helpful about this is that it gives us a starting point. Even if the student says, I'm at 3, we can try to explore that a little bit further. What's making it a 3 and not a 1? Or what would help you move to a 4 or a 10? Now, the conversation can shift from just identifying the problem to identifying small, realistic steps moving forward. And finally, focusing on understanding rather than fixing it right away. For us as social workers, sometimes it's natural for us to jump into problem solving. But often, the student needs to be heard first. If we move too quickly into solutions, it can feel like we're minimizing their experience, even if that's not our intention. So instead, we slow down, we listen, we reflect, we validate. And this might sound like, that sounds really frustrating, or I can see why that felt overwhelming. And once a student feels understood, they're much more open to support, to the guidance, and to change. Because when students can name what they're feeling and feel understood in that moment, that's when real change can begin. And this is just another strategy that we can use to support them more effectively. And ultimately, our goal is not to just support the student in the moment. Eventually, it's to build independence. Because if a student can only regulate when the adult is present, then we haven't fully equipped them yet. So we want to be a model. We want to teach and reinforce skills that they can carry with them, even when we are not there. And that's where real, lasting change happens. This can look like teaching them the coping and regulation skills, reinforcing the problem solving, encouraging their voice and their ownership, and supporting their growth beyond us being present. And another important shift in our work is learning to see the strength in the student. Often, when behavior is challenging, it's easy to focus on what's not working. But when we take a step back, we begin to recognize that every student brings strengths, resilience, and lived experiences into the room. That means honoring their cultural identity and being mindful that their experiences may be very different than our own. It also means avoiding assumptions. Instead of assuming we understand their behavior, we ask questions and we stay curious. And just as important, we highlight what is working. Even small things, their effort, their coping attempts, their moments of regulation. Those are all the strengths we can build on. It can sound like, hey, I noticed last week you got angry and you stepped away and you asked to come to my office for a calm space. Great job! Because when we focus on their strengths, we shift from fixing the students to empowering them. What's one strength you've seen in a student that others might overlook? The strategies we're talking about today are grounded in evidence-based approaches. Approaches like motivational interviewing, solution-focused brief therapy, strength-based practices, and cultural humility. And while each of these has its own framework, they all share something in common. They focus on collaboration, on respect, and building on students' strength. And one thing to highlight is that learning doesn't just happen through talking. We can add interactive tools like games, role playing, scenarios. Things like this can significantly increase our engagement. Now let's talk about what this looks like in real time when a student is escalated. In these moments, our goals shift. It's no longer about correcting behavior, it's about helping the student regulate. What we do matters. We can validate feelings. I can see this is really frustrating. We pause and we focus on the regulation first, because a dysregulated student cannot process correction. We offer simple coping strategies: breathing, stepping away, or grounding. And we provide choices. We help the student regain a sense of control. And just as important is what we avoid. We avoid lecturing. We avoid asking why in the moment, because that can feel confrontational. And we avoid jumping straight to consequences while the student is escalated. Because remember, in that moment, the brain is in survival mode, not learning mode. What's something you've seen that escalates a situation quickly? And what's something you've seen that helps calm it down? Another key part of this work is helping students build the language for their emotions. Many students aren't trying to be difficult, they simply don't have the words to express what they're feeling. So we can support this through storytelling, prompts, or simply creating safe spaces for them to express their experiences safely. And this is also where another concept adapted from Dan Siegel comes in: name it to tame it. The idea is that when we're working to help students name what they're feeling, we actually help calm their brain. If we think back to the brain slides we discussed earlier, when a student is overwhelmed, the thinking brain goes offline and the emotional brain takes over. But when we give students language for their emotions, we're helping re-engage that thinking part of the brain. This can even look like, I feel blank because blank. I need blank. So instead of them reacting, they begin to process what they're feeling. That might sound like, it sounds like you're really frustrated. That felt overwhelming, didn't it? And over time, students begin to internalize that language, and they're better able to regulate themselves. De-escalation language: what to say in the moment. Sometimes it's not about having the perfect strategy. It's about using the right language in that moment. Simple phrases like, "You're safe," "I'm here with you," "Let's step somewhere quieter," "Let's help calm your body down first," or "We'll figure this out together." These statements communicate safety, support, and partnership. And once the student is calm, that's when we can move into reflection. What was the hardest about that moment? What helped you calm down? What can we try next time? And before we close, let's revisit the scenario we talked about earlier. A student is asked to put their phone away. They become defensive, they raise their voice, and they refuse to comply. Remember, at first glance, it's easy for us to focus on the behavior because it may look like defiance, disrespect, or non-compliance. But now, let's slow this moment down. What might actually be happening beneath the surface? Maybe the student is already overwhelmed. Maybe they're dealing with something outside of school. Maybe they felt embarrassed being corrected in front of their peers. And in that moment, their brain has now shifted into survival mode. The thinking brain goes offline, and the emotional brain takes over. So if we respond with correction right away, we may unintentionally escalate the situation. But when we apply what we've learned today, our responses begin to shift. We start with rapport. We approach with a calm, non-judgmental presence. We focus on how the student is feeling, not just what they're doing. Then, consistency. Our response is predictable, steady, not reactive. The student knows what to expect from us. Then, attunement. Our tone is calm, our body language is open, our pacing slows down. What we're doing here is communicating safety, even without saying much. And then we can move into conversation. We might ask, "Hey, what's going on right now?" Or use a scaling question. "Where are you from a 1 to 10? We might even help them name what they're feeling. "It seems like you're really frustrated." Or, "Can you name the feeling?" And in doing so, we help shift the student from reaction to regulation. And that's the difference. The situation doesn't get handled, it becomes an opportunity for connection, for skill building, and for growth. Now let's take a moment to consider the opposite. What if we didn't respond that way? What if we moved straight to the correction? "I told you to put your phone away. This is your last warning." What if our tone was more directive, or we reacted out of frustration? In that moment, the student is already in survival mode. So instead of regulating, they escalate. The behavior increases, the interaction becomes a power struggle, and the situation may end in removal, consequences, or disconnection. And while that may stop the behavior in the moment, it doesn't build the skill, it doesn't build the relationship, and it doesn't address what was underneath. So we have two very different outcomes. One response leads to escalation, and the other creates a space of regulation, connection, and growth. And that difference comes down to how we show up. I want to take a moment to pause and reflect. Think about your campus, your agency, your students, your daily interactions. Where do you already see these strategies happening? Where are relationships being built, where students feel safe, where adults are showing up consistently? And now consider the opposite. Where are the gaps? Where are students struggling to regulate, or where situations tend to escalate quickly? As you think about that, what is one small shift that you could make this week? Not something big or overwhelming, just one intentional change. Maybe it's slowing down your response. Maybe it's asking one more question instead of giving a directive. Maybe it's being more visible and present. Because remember, meaningful change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in those small, consistent moments over time. I would like to share a resource that I've personally used and I've shared with staff in the past. And it's been really helpful in creating shared understanding of how we support students. The Search Institute, the 40 Developmental Assets. It focuses on internal and external strengths. It supports resilience and positive development in students, and it's practical for school-based application. I would really encourage you to take some time to review it and consider how it might be useful not just for you, but for your campus as a whole. Because when teachers and staff are using the same language around support, consistency increases. And that's where we start to see stronger outcomes for students and for our school environment. This is where our work shifts from support to sustainability. I hope this tool helps you move forward in the work from individual support to a more unified, campus-wide approach. As we bring everything together, I want to highlight a few takeaways. First, behavior is communication, which means when we see behavior, it's important that we look beyond it and we shift our lens and we ask, what is the student trying to express? Second, connection comes before correction. Because remember, students are far more likely to respond when they feel safe, seen, and understood. Third, regulation comes before instruction. Because when a student is overwhelmed, they cannot process correction or learning. Fourth, consistency builds trust over time. It's not one big moment, it's the repeated, predictable interactions that matter. And finally, how we show up matters. Our tone, our presence, our response all communicate something with our students. And those small moments can create lasting change. And as you hear these, you might notice that none of these strategies are complicated, but they do require intention and consistency in how we show up for our students each day. Remember, the work you do matters. As social workers, counselors, and educators, the work we do matters deeply. And often, it's not in those big interventions that make a difference. It's in the small moments, the calm response instead of a reactive one, a simple check in instead of a correction, and a moment of understanding instead of judgments. Those are the moments that build trust. And for many students, this may be the one of few places where they're experiencing that kind of support. So as you leave today, I encourage you to carry this with you. The way you show up has the power to either escalate a moment or transform it. And when we lead with a connection, we create space for real, lasting change. And over time, small moments begin to add up. They shape how students see themselves, how they see adults, how they see social workers, mental health professionals, and how they begin to respond in future situations. Thank you for all of the work that you do each day to support students. The impact that you make may not always be visible in the moment, but it is meaningful and it is lasting. I appreciate your time and your dedication and your commitment for showing up for yourself and for your students. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post-test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.